to Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting number 5 as part of the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities process. I'm Sylvia Chigurski, helping to facilitate today, and I'll go over our agenda and some overall protocols. But just to get started, I'm going to hand it over to Commissioner Warren as one of our co-chairs to give us some welcoming remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 5th meeting of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. My name is Stuart Warren. I am the LCDC co-chair for this Rulemaking Advisory Committee, zooming in from sunny Southern Oregon today. We appreciate your time and the wealth and diversity of knowledge and lived experience that you bring to the climate-friendly and equitable communities effort. I'm confident that your contributions will greatly improve the proposed rules and other components of DLCD's work to reduce climate pollution and to improve equitable outcomes for Oregon's priority populations. We have a full agenda today and a variety of topics to cover, including an overview of needed progress in key areas from the statewide transportation strategy, a brief synopsis of guidance received at our last meeting regarding monitoring and reporting, review and discussion of proposed amendments to Division 44 regarding greenhouse gas reductions in metropolitan areas, and a review and discussion of equity mapping tools. Today, I took a brief walk around our local reservoir here in Southern Oregon and was astounded by the lack of water. Southern Oregon is experiencing prolonged drought, and we're not looking forward to another fire season. This just helps to highlight the importance of the work we're doing today. I'd also like to take a second to reflect on the recent violence brought against our Asian American and Pacific Islander community. This once again highlights the importance of the work we are doing to lift all of our community members up and to continue to fight for equality for all. I look forward to the conversation today and now turn us back to Sylvia to provide an overview of the meeting and meeting logistics.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate that. Yeah, and I want to acknowledge the senseless violence that's been going on as well. It's hard to go on with our daily work, but it's good to reflect. And of course, you know, my heart's breaking for anyone that's been affected by that, personally, professionally, or any other way. So heading into our meeting today, I'm just going to share our agenda briefly. And as the commissioner stated, you know, we do have a full agenda and really 4 key topics for the day. One is just kind of a review of the statewide transportation strategy and really what it will take to meet the state's climate pollution reduction goals in the transportation sector. And we'll have some time for some brief Q&A discussion there. And then some time for monitoring and report out. So just kind of what was heard at RAC meeting number 4, how that's being used in rule and guidance, and just a kind of a quick poll on that topic to see whether we're on the right track. And then the 2 big topics today are really review of the proposed amendments to Division 44. So DLCD will kind of walk through some of the proposed revisions, and we'll have time for questions and comments, and really looking for those higher level comments and looking for more of the wordsmithing and detailed comments through your written comments that you provide. And then we'll end with the discussion on equity mapping. So reviewing some reasons that staff recommend using equity mapping and kind of what that could look like. And we'll have time for breakout rooms for that discussion. And then we'll end with some next steps and wrap up. So that's our agenda for the day. And just some kind of reminders, you know, we're using a lot of different tools for our discussion, so polling, breakout rooms, large group discussion. So always let us know if this is working for you. And always also hope that you can provide additional written comment after these meetings through the surveys that you receive. And in advance of the meetings, of course, you receive a discussion worksheet that has the questions that we'll be focusing on. So we hope that you're able to use those to prepare for your comments as we head into these meetings. And a reminder that just for kind of webinar logistics, keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking. Use video when you can, especially when you are speaking. We know that bandwidth issues can be an issue. Feel free to rename yourself in the platform if you haven't already to whatever you prefer to be named. And we have chat open for just troubleshooting. We hope that the conversation kind of stays out in dialogue here through our voices. But if you have any chat troubleshooting issues, feel free to send a message to Ingrid or as our Zoom host, and she can help with that. Members of the public that are here when listening in, thanks for your participation. And you're always welcome to provide your comments through the DLCD website, through the email address, which I think we can put in the chat in just a second. And we know this is a large chunk of your day, 3-hour meeting. We just have a short break scheduled here. So feel free to stand up, stretch, walk around as you need to throughout the meeting to take care of yourself. And I think we announced this before, but this meeting is also being recorded, just so that you all are aware. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kevin for some brief kind of updates, and then we'll head into our first topic for the day.
All right. Well, thank you, Sylvia, and good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see another great turnout for our Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting. I want to upfront a few things about the schedule. One is a change that's been made. Bill, yeah, there we go. So looking at our adoption schedule for the rules, ultimately, our initial schedule had initial hearing in November and then a follow-up at a special meeting in December. It turned out that wasn't really going to work out. And frankly, we see the need for some additional time for a number of things. And so we went to the commission earlier this month, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, and basically sought their approval for a shift to the schedule, and which they have approved. And that change will essentially move us back a little bit. So now we would have our initial hearing with the Land Conservation and Development Commission in January of 2021. And then the second hearing, which would be this hearing at which the rules would be adopted, would be in March of I'm sorry, I said January 2021. It's actually January 2022, the first hearing. And then the adoption hearing is March 2022. That accomplishes a number of things. It allows additional time for another round of community conversations in the fall. We're recognizing that there's all the stuff that we will be talking about after this break we're about to enter into. And we need some time to go back out to the communities and have those conversations about that work. And so tentatively, we're looking in October of this year for holding a second round of community conversations so that we can get input on the draft rules. We also recognize that it takes time to review and finalize the rules prior to our first hearing. There's a very complicated process, and we want to make sure we get that right. Coordination with other agencies is also an important component. So, little change to the schedule. And so this is our last meeting before the hiatus that we've been talking about. So after this meeting, we will be taking time to do a number of things. We'll be holding our community conversations. We will be working with the performance measures work group. We've got some other things I'll review in just a minute. And then we'll be coming back in July. So we had a meeting in June. We've canceled that meeting. So you can take that one off your schedule. We'll be coming back for our first meeting on July 12th. And we will be adding another meeting in November. So you will be seeing a doodle poll coming out soon, looking for a good date. It's going to be earlier in November. We're not going to jam up against the holiday. So look for that poll coming out soon. All right, next slide, please. So we're about to embark into our first round of community conversations, and I think that invitation was sent to all RAC members, so you should have gotten an email with more information about that. And we encourage all RAC members to sign up for at least one, but if you're interested, you can sign up for more than one. These meetings are open to all interested people. You can either register online from the link that was sent to you, or if you can't find that one, just go to DLCD's Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities homepage, and you'll find signups for that. And those dates are on the next slide. And they're coming right up. So April 6th, we're going to have our first community conversation and combine the Albany and Corvallis regions. April 13, combined Medford and Grants Pass regions. We'll have a community conversation there. May 11th, Bend, the 19th, Eugene Springfield, and May 25th, the Salem Kaiser meeting. So we're looking forward to those conversations and getting input from those communities and other interested persons. I think I see Casaria has put some information in the chat for you. So the link to the sign up as well as the address for our homepage. So thank you. Next slide, please. Another thing that we're going to be doing is holding a green infrastructure webinar. This will be on May 6th. Our very own RAC member, Dr. Shandas, will be one of the presenters. We'll have a panel of folks talking about green infrastructure in cities and recognizing that, as we talk about creating climate-friendly areas, compact mixed-use areas, we want to make sure that those areas are pleasant and livable and include that green context that everyone needs in order to thrive. And so this webinar will be touching on some ideas for how to do those things. So Thursday, May 6th, 3:30 p.m. In the interim, you might be wondering what's going to be happening between now and when we come back in July. A number of things behind the scenes. So first of all, of course, we'll be holding the community conversations, and following that, we'll be summarizing the guidance and the feedback that we receive. We will also be developing concepts and draft rule language. So this will be, again, that second part of the things we'll be discussing starting in July. We'll also be working with our performance measures work group and refining those proposals to bring back to this RAC, and also engaging in coordination with other state agencies and local government.
It's really interesting to see side by side, like what.
So I think that's it for me on the schedule. I guess I don't know if there are any questions, if we need to pause for that at this point. I see none.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I think if any questions, feel free to get in touch with Kevin or the CFEC email address, and I know DLCD is hoping you all can attend those community conversations in your communities. So really important. Thanks, Kevin.
Yep.
Okay, well, with that, I think I'll turn it over to Brian Hurley at Oregon Department of Transportation to kick us off with the statewide transportation strategy. And here, really, the intent is kind of so that we're all on the same page with what it might take to get to the intended goal of this. And we have a little bit of time for discussion.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia. Hello, everyone. I am Brian Hurley with the Oregon Department of Transportation in the Climate Office, as Sylvia just said. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the statewide transportation strategy and the trajectories needed to reach the vision. Next slide, please, Bill. Great. So the Statewide Transportation Strategy, or STS, is Oregon's roadmap to achieve our GHG reduction goals. It is a statewide scenario planning effort that examines all aspects of the transportation system, including the movement of both people and goods. The STS was collaboratively developed in partnership with state agencies, local governments, stakeholders, private citizens, and the business sector. The STS was completed in 2013. Next slide, please. So the STS looks out to the year 2050 and describes what it will take to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. In 2018, the Oregon Transportation Commission adopted an amendment to incorporate the STS as part of the Oregon Transportation Plan, and the 2018 STS monitoring report identified our progress to date on following this roadmap. Next. The development of the STS vision included the analysis of a number of factors that influence transportation sector emissions, and with a varying level of intensity. The analysis included vehicle and fuel efficiency, operations and technology, pricing and markets, land use changes, and mode share. Vehicles and fuels and mode share changes were the highest levels of intensity that were investigated for the STS vision. Next, please. So overall, achieving the STS vision can result in 60% fewer transportation GHG when compared to our 1990 levels. However, this is still short of our 2050 goal levels. So as you can see on the far right of that chart is our 2050 goal, and the next bar over to the left is the STS vision. So it still does not get us there. And next slide. So our current trends, policies, and investments are heading in the correct direction, but they fall short of what is needed to achieve the vision. This chart shows that for light-duty vehicles, there is a gap between our current policies, investments, and where we need to be. More action is needed to fill the gap between the trends and the vision. Next. Strategies. The STS contains a number of strategies with a variety of actions that, if implemented, can help Oregon reach the vision. The STS strategies and actions include vehicle and fuel technology, systems and operations, transportation options, more efficient land use, and pricing, funding, and markets. Next. To achieve the STS vision and meet the state's GHG goals will require a combination of different actions. One strategy or action alone will not reach the goal. While vehicles and fuels, represented by the blue bars in this chart, will make up a large portion of the reductions, they are not enough on their own. And vehicles and fuel actions have a direct impact on transportation emissions, and these include vehicle powertrain mix, vehicle fuel economy, and changes to commercial fleet vehicles. So the enhancements to systems operations, transportation options, and pricing are also needed. And these are the green and orange bars on the charts. And you can see that together with the vehicles and fuels, they get us to the STS vision. And systems operation actions help to keep the existing system and the vehicles that are operating on it more efficient. And this includes parking, intelligent transportation systems to make the highway more efficient, driving efficiency programs to make people drive more efficient, transportation demand programs for both short and long distance trips, and changes in road growth. Transportation options provides alternatives so that individuals have different modes available so that they're able to drive less. And this includes transit service, walking, biking, and personal electric vehicles, as well as car sharing and carpooling. And finally, pricing actions support these other actions and provide funding for quality transportation options. And pricing actions include road cost recovery, such as gas taxes and VMT fees, as well as congestion pricing. It is very important to note that pricing actions should be paired with the development of quality bicycle, pedestrian, and transit networks at the local level to provide alternatives to driving. The enhancements to these modes can also help to reduce any negative equity impacts of pricing programs. Next slide, please. The STS 2050 vision, if achieved, would result in a decrease in daily vehicle miles traveled of over 20% per person. And the STS vision assumes that the local actions will largely have an impact on this vehicle miles traveled change. Next slide, please. Continued action and partnerships. So to achieve the vision and realize our GHG goals will require a large amount of partnership and collaboration between cities and counties, state agencies, the legislature, and the private sector. Next slide, please. There are a number of strategies and actions in the STS that local jurisdictions can undertake to bring us closer to achieving the vision and reaching our goals. So now we're going to go over some of those. Next slide, please. Active transportation and transportation options. To achieve the STS vision will require a large increase in the amount of short distance trips that are transitioning from single occupancy automobiles to bicycles and other active modes. The use of active modes has grown over time, but is still short of what the vision calls for, which is about 40% of all short trips using active modes. The SDS vision also includes an increase in the coverage of transportation options programs, with more employees participating in workplace demand management programs. Next slide, please. More efficient land use. The SDS vision includes an increase in the number of urban households that are residing in compact mixed-use neighborhoods. Mixed-use development in urban areas help to reduce demand for vehicle travel, shorten trips, and expand non-auto travel mode choices. And they also enhance public transportation at the same time. Well, here in Oregon, it seems to be that UGB expansion tends to happen in large chunks at a time, but overall, the last 10 years has mostly been on track across the metropolitan areas. Share of households in mixed-use areas has been increasing since 2005, and there is more anticipated, in our adopted land use plans. However, it is important to note that this is still shy of the STS vision, and some areas are carrying more of this burden than others. Next slide, please. Transit service and vehicles. Public transit is a very important part of the STS vision, and the vision includes a large increase in the annual number of longer distance trips that use non-auto modes, such as public transit and carpooling. The transit funding that was provided by House Bill 2017 in the transportation funding package is just enough to keep pace with our population growth. And this is especially true in smaller metropolitan areas. So more transit funding is needed to meet our vision and our goals. And it is also important that the STS vision includes a shift in public transit and demand response vehicles to low and no emission vehicles, such as electric vehicles, There's lots of different types of vehicles out there. And currently, Rogue Valley and Salem-Keizer transit agencies have some compressed natural gas buses, and many transit providers have recently announced plans to consider transitioning to electric buses, which is great news. Next slide, please. Pricing, funding, and markets. Well, the pricing actions in the STS will largely be led by state agencies and the legislature. Local pricing actions that can influence transportation choices and help to reduce GHG include gas taxes, parking fees, and congestion fees. Overall, the pricing actions at the federal, state, and local levels are well below what is contained in the STS vision. So there's more room to move in pricing as well. So next slide, please. Great. Well, that concludes my slides. Thank you very much. I believe I'm available for questions now.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
And so really the intent here is kind of just to show what it might take to get to the overall goals here and kind of what's left to get there. And we don't have any particular discussion questions for the group, but if you have any clarifying questions that you have for Brian or the team, or just any overall comments, reflections on what you heard, we welcome that. And feel free to raise your hand in the platform, and we can try to get your questions answered or just hear from you. I see Noel's hand up. So Noel, go ahead, and then Jana.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Brian. I guess I just call our attention to the fact that you mentioned switching vehicles, for example, to electric, and we've got bills and a lot of initiatives going to try and enable more electrification at whether it's a mixed-use multifamily project or an office building. But of course, Portland General Electric or Pacific Corp don't simply have the power to provide vis-a-vis their like transformers and main lines to the buildings, and or design review in the city of Portland strenuously objects to how very large transformers looks. And then separately, Portland Bureau of Transportation has disallowed, from an effective legal economic standpoint, us putting large transformers into the sidewalks underground. And so there's this is a singular example of how I love transportation, because it brings so many of the issues of design or bureaucratic engineer sidewalks and powertrains together. And so I just want to take the opportunity to kind of like get this group's mind in that way, because the details really matter, and or the general current operations of the bureaucracies are basically perfectly directly opposed to the initiatives that you laid out, which are great. And so we've got a lot of work ahead of us to do. So thank you for the explanation.
Thank you, Noel. That's a very important point that you raised. And yes, there are gaps between where we are now and where we need to be. The infrastructure to utilize the EVs and alt modes is one of those major gaps. And I will say that ODOT is in the middle of a project now called the Transportation Electrification Inventory Needs Analysis, which is identifying the gaps in the system, which is identifying the gaps in the current system and the changes that will need to happen in order to make EV charging more readily available. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, thanks, Noel, Brian. And Jana.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Brian, I've got a couple of questions. The pandemic that we're still addressing here, the COVID pandemic, has been described as a disruptor event. And I'm curious to know if ODOT is reassessing demand management on the system with more people working from home. That seems to be a real trend for, there are a lot of articles about companies that are telling people they can continue to work from home, what that impact will be on the transportation needs. And at the same time that we're talking about having more people working remotely, a lot of those same people are moving out of compact urban density into maybe other states and other places that are not so compact. And if in fact that's going to change some of DLCD's goals with respect to that. So I'm curious to know how we're looking at these events.
Those are great questions. Yes, there is a rise in teleworking and telecommuting. ODOT is in the process of looking into the long-term impacts of what that means for transportation demand management and the impacts to the system. I will say that we don't know what it's going to be longer term. And I would say that while there was a big change in travel patterns from COVID, it seems to be now that we're back to normal. People just happen to be driving for different reasons rather than commuting to work. So I think that's where we're at now. And I would agree that moving forward in the longer term, for certain types of jobs or markets, you could say, telecommuting will be a very important strategy to reduce transportation demand. But at the same time, there will be lots of members of the workforce who won't have the option to telecommute. So we need to make sure that they have adequate options as well.
Well, I was just curious to know if ODOT was taking that into some of their planning exercises now, the impacts of some of these changes. Or, I mean, recognizing them as one thing, trying to factor them in is another. So I was curious to know.
I would say that we are in the beginning stages of that. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Sarah?
Thanks. I was just curious. So the STS lays out a VMT reduction of about 20% in the appendices. And given that ODOT, dispenses a lot of money to jurisdictions for lots of things, where are the opportunities to tie the dispersal of that money to the achievement of climate goals? So where can ODOT build in kind of carrots and sticks for jurisdictions to do a better job of managing land use and transportation to achieve those VMT reduction and greenhouse gas emission goals?
That is an excellent question, Sarah. Thank you very much. That is one of the things that we are working to figure out right now with DLCD as part of this rulemaking. I think the outcomes of this rulemaking will affect what that looks like. We are in the process of determining where our authorities lie and what that means for how ODOT is able to distribute federal dollars. So you are correct. You're on the right track there. It's a matter of what we are able to do.
Thank you. And Mary Kyle?
Thank you. Maybe I'll just follow up on, I have a question, but I want to follow up on that answer to Sarah's question, because at least I read the governor's executive order as independently directing ODOT to establish GHG emission reduction performance metrics. That's what it says. You know, not only within this rulemaking activity, but on its own. And that might be a little outside of what we're talking about today, but I don't see that as something for ODOT that's only dependent on this RAC and its rulemaking, but an independent direction to ODOT, which would obviously be significant for achieving greenhouse gas reductions if those were established and incorporated into the things that Sarah was talking about, money dispersal. So it might be a comment more than a question.
Okay.
I mean, you can answer it if you want, but I just see that as independent, not just tied into this.
Well, yeah, I would.
Yeah, go on, Brian.
I would say that in terms of what's in the executive order, there are many things in there in the executive order that ODOT was required to do. One of the things was look at GHG measures. That is being done through, as part of the Every Mile Counts, there are GHG reduction performance measures, excuse me, it's quite the mouthful, for all of the state agencies. And they are currently in partnership trying to determine what those are. So that's one aspect of performance monitoring. And then in terms of ODOT specific, we are looking at ways we currently did, and this is not my project, so I cannot speak much about it. That could be a future topic maybe, or we could follow up. But ODOT is looking at ways to put a GHG reduction lens on the STIP, which is the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, which is the list of the projects
Right.
that ODOT is going to build.
Okay, because clearly, but there's a direction from the governor to establish those metrics as part of the STS project. Okay, well
then,
right.
thank you, Mary Kyle. That makes a lot more sense now. So that specific direction you are speaking of are the Every Mile Counts measures, and they're currently being developed in partnership with ODOT, DLCD, DOE, and DEQ. We are aiming to give an update to the governor's office on those in June. Thank you for clarifying.
Great, and because clearly, as the well, I think there's a report coming up. The STS is you're doing a report coming up later this year, right, on how we're doing on meeting the STS. But so far, I believe there's another report coming on that progress report. But the Oregon Global Warming Commission and the ODOT's own work shows that we're falling quite short on meeting those, including most specifically on the land use, and the power of money in ODOT for transportation facilities clearly plays an important part in this, a critical part. And I just wanted to get back to those two things that you had talked about, the land use, urban growth boundary, the compact mixed use areas. And we're making baby steps of progress maybe, but we are nowhere near going from 20% to 30% of all development in mixed use compact areas, or shifting 40% of modes to walking and biking. So clearly we're not doing enough, and we have to do a lot more in this rulemaking. But I wanted to just ask you not to call it a burden, which was the word you had used, that when you said some cities are, or some municipalities, regions are taking on more of the burden of meeting mixed use compact walkable areas. And that has benefits across many bottom lines, not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I just would like to say, let's not use that actually, and we need to make sure that we remember that this is a land use planning undertaking, and there's many bottom lines, including for health and saving money of households and jurisdictions for mixed use compact, more walkable areas that are transit served. So
thank you very much for noting that. I would agree that burden is probably not the best term to use there. Hopefully it's obvious that I'm reading some notes from some other folks there, and these are not all my talking points. So thank you very much.
Please talk to whoever wrote the word burden, because we shouldn't, that is not how it should be talked about.
Duly noted.
Thank you.
Right.
Kyle. Great. Okay. And let's see, I think we have, I see some thumbs up for that as well. So appreciate that. And 2 more hands up. Let's just take these 2 other quick comments and then we'll move into our next topic. So Paige and then Emma.
Yeah, hi, I wanted to talk about the data metrics, Brian. On B, where it talks about shifting active modes in public transportation, it says that 40% of SOV trips will need to be shifted to bicycle or other similar modes. And then in the next one with transit, it gives a specific number of trips, approximately 130 trips per person per year, which breaks down to 2.5 trips per week for those longer trips. And that resonates a lot more with me, just seeing a number of trips per person and then breaking it down further like I did to being 2.5 trips per week. I think that not only helps me from just a perspective of understanding what that mode split is for the average person, but also I think for transit planning purposes, it helps me to understand what the capacity of the transit system would need to eventually be to handle all those trips. That's a lot of trips. And as you've identified, the transit service already is inequipped to be able to provide the convenience for someone to want to choose it for a segment of our population. But I think of it also from a supply side. What do we need to supply in number of buses, number of seats to actually accommodate those trips? So I think it would help for me to at least to see the other one, the one for shorter trips, active modes, to also be broken down into similar trips per person, per month, per day, per year. And then, there's a lot of level of service planning that has happened in other communities. I know Eugene has done some where they've actually looked at, like that we do with capacity modeling for autos. We've also done similar things with the bike lanes, with the sidewalks to be able to also handle the demand that you're forecasting. So I think for active transportation planners or public works, similarly, if we're looking at it from a supply side, how many sidewalks and width of sidewalks and how many bike lanes and widths of bike lanes would we need on our transportation system to be able to handle all those trips? If we're in this dreamy, let's do this vision, I think we also need to look at what does that really look like on the ground to be able to supply those trips so that it's not congested, if that makes sense.
Those are great points. Thank you very much. I would agree that we need more of those first and last mile type of connections and investments to get people to and from transit for those longer distance trips. For sure. And then in terms of getting the numbers for the bike percent, I will have to ask my colleague who does the math for that one. I don't know if that's available or not, but we can check in and see about that.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, because I'm not sure if you understood what I was saying, we're talking a lot about what people should be doing from a behavior standpoint and shifting their trips, but we're not talking about what the infrastructure is going to need to look like, or how many transit buses are going to need to be provided if in fact all of those trips are shifted, so that we're not overcrowding buses and we're not overcrowding our standard bike lane and we're not overcrowding our standard sidewalk. Like I would like to see the if then scenario, if everyone did in fact shift their travel behavior to do what you're wanting, how many widths of bike lanes would we need and how many buses would we need on the system to accommodate those trips?
Good point. Thank you for clarifying. I think that a large part, and the interesting thing about the STS, is that there's many strategies. So I think what that looks like is different for different regions. There's no set number out there. So that would be my thought on that one. And I would say that you are correct. We In terms of the width of bike lanes, there's lots of really talented bike and pedestrian folks out there that I think can answer that question. And the same for the number of or the size of buses that we need. So that's something that we can consider, and we can definitely think about adding to our language, but also what we're looking at when we think about actions to implement the STS. So thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you. And Emma.
Thank you. I really appreciate what Paige was saying, and I appreciate Noel's earlier comment about some of the challenges that occur when we take this great concept that sounds wonderful at the state level, and then we actually try to start implementing it on the ground. Sometimes I think there's also a little bit of a disconnect between the state's kind of acknowledgement and understanding of what's happening at the local level and what's actually happening at the local level. So I appreciated your comment about electric buses, and just wanted to highlight that Lane Transit District is already taking huge strides forward with this. Just earlier this month, actually, 11 more electric buses were delivered to Lane Transit District. They have 19 more that are anticipated for order and receipt by 2023. And this is all tied to larger climate goals, which they're actually ahead in accomplishing some of the targets. So in October of 2020, the LTD board approved a climate action policy statement and goals. Goal 1 was in the short term to have 25 electric buses within 3 years. So that's what that bus purchasing is helping to accomplish. Goal 2, the long term, is to have 100% of the fleet turnover and phase out of fossil fuels by 2035, and to have 75% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2030. And then there's other considerations to go above and beyond and do more than that. But I think that it would be really helpful through this rulemaking process to tie to the local efforts. We've also funded through our region with congestion mitigation air quality funds, the ability to hopefully purchase cleaner fuel school buses that will be running on our transportation system every day of the year that we have school in session. And yet there have been constraints similar to what Noel was saying with some of the barriers to implementation with the Buy America program and the federal legislation and kind of rules in place. There are no buses that fulfill those requirements. So we're trying at the local level to follow through, use the funding for what it's intended to do, which is to improve our air quality. And yet we can't make some of these purchases because of different legislation and rules that are kind of overlapping and conflicting with one another.
Yeah. Thank you, Emma. Appreciate that. All right. Well, thank you all for your comments. And Brian, did you have any kind of closing thoughts before we move on?
No, thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, the DLCD staff can direct them over. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. You can always put more in the survey or through email comments after today. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so let's move into our monitoring and reporting piece here. And so as you remember, we kind of touched on this at our last Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting with a Jamboard sticky note exercise. So Kevin's going to kind of reflect on that and talk about what the agency is doing moving forward. And then we have time for a quick poll and a little bit of discussion.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yes, I'm sorry, I've had to shorten this bit because I want to leave time later in the meeting for some of the more meaty stuff. But this feedback loop, I think, is important. And so essentially, we did that Jamboard exercise at our last meeting, and the comments were great. We got a lot of great input. Fell into a few different categories. Bill, if you'd show the next slide. And what we've done here is just to summarize, and I want to make it clear, if your comment didn't show up here, don't worry. It's still there, and we're still taking it into consideration. So the full text of everything we heard from the group is reflected in your packets and the memo in your packet. But essentially, this is some of the stuff that was recommended as things that we might think about monitoring and reporting on. So fell into different categories on housing and neighborhoods, certainly monitoring housing production in climate-friendly areas, monitoring housing affordability and changes in housing affordability. Also city codes as they relate to, say, climate-friendly areas and what's allowed there, as well as the process for reviewing development and permitting development. These are things that may be monitored and reported. So good thoughts, I think. On the funding side, of course, the balance of funding to transit, to other alternative transportation modes, to highway work, housing, that metric I think might be a useful one. Of course, we have to think about data availability and how that gets reported, but that's important, as well as for the work itself, contracts awarded to minority-owned firms and sourcing of materials, good considerations as well. Next slide. On engagement and equity, of course, summarizing a full page of feedback into a paragraph is impossible. But some of the things we heard a lot about were monitoring, reporting on modes of outreach and engagement with priority populations. Of course, infrastructure investments in priority population areas. Another metric that was proposed, share of population by income, race, et cetera, within a 15-minute walk of transit service to look at who's benefiting from improvements that are being made. A lot of good ideas in that area. On the connectivity side, measures of sidewalk and bikeway connectivity, especially to schools. Also metrics for access to goods and services for BIPOC populations and other priority populations, so measured in terms of walking distance, travel distance and time. And then on the last slide, safety and transportation. We heard a lot about safety and transportation and both quantitative and qualitative safety data. So not just numbers, but also some of the qualitative perceptions of safety. And so the next item, survey data on safety by mode and access to transportation options was an interesting way of getting at that. So this would be a survey of the general population. How safe do you feel on a bike? What modes do you feel you have access to? Those kinds of things might be a useful metric to make sure that we're moving things in the right direction. Of course, transit usage, service improvement data is also important. And then in the great other category, ideas about infrastructure resiliency during adverse weather events. Of course, transportation mode percentages for all trips. So percent single occupant vehicle, percent transit, percent bicycle, et cetera. Transportation options outreach and utilization rates. So that's, again, that sort of transportation demand management program where an employer might say, free bus passes or other incentives for people to carpool, and kind of reporting on how many employers are doing that and how many of the employees are opting into those kinds of programs. And then, of course, lastly, data on electric vehicle facilities and usage. That's not everything we heard. It's just a sample, really. But I think what we're wanting to get today is just a sense of, both from what I've just gone over, but also the memo in the packet. Did we hear you correctly? Did we miss anything? And any questions or concerns or clarifications that people want to make?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. And so we do want to just put up a quick poll that I think Ingrid will launch here. And just want to get a sense from what you're seeing here, thinking about all the factors that Kevin just laid out, does this seem to be on the right track, that with this monitoring and reporting framework, kind of incorporating all these elements and having reporting for local governments, does it seem to be on the right track, on the wrong track, or do you just need more information to better understand it? Because this is kind of a lot to try to condense into a short presentation here. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to provide your thoughts in the poll. And as you all do that, you can go ahead and get some hands up with just, did we hear you correctly? Was there anything that Kevin said that you thought was missing, that, this should be monitored and reported on too? Any other questions or concerns, or just any additional comments? And let's see, I'll go to, Sushmita, I know you're your main is also here. So we do want to try to get to RAC primary members before alternates. So let's go to Caitlin, and then let's go to Caitlin first.
So I missed the last meeting, so this is kind of a question/comment. But I looked through the packet, and in terms of monitoring and reporting, I didn't see anything that necessarily called out indicators of displacement. And I was wondering if that was something that was discussed, or if not, if that's something that should be included. So I'm thinking maybe areas that are receiving a certain investment in, transit walkability. Are those areas also seeing higher portions of increased housing costs, or or BIPOC community members priorities being pushed out as the investments are being made? So that might be something that's addressed in equity mapping, but I was thinking that might be an important monitoring measure as well, so jurisdictions can see in real time whether these communities are experiencing displacement.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Caitlin and Margie.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was a little late today. I think my comment fits nicely with Caitlin's. As many of you know, Metro has done monitoring at the regional level for Climate Smart for many years now. And I do think you're on the right track in terms of the statewide monitoring. I do urge you, though, to track it at the regional or local level to really be able to see the land use effects. For example, trip distance is really important, and you're going to see different things pop at the regional level or at the local level when you focus down, such as displacement. It's easier to look at that issue at a regional or a local scale. A counter example of that is when you scale something statewide, and there's more of an emphasis on through trips. Electric vehicles, for example, are going to perform better because you're assuming longer trip length. So this is my just encouragement to not just do the monitoring statewide, but also make sure we're doing this at the regional level.
And just a clarifying question. So you talk about regional or local. Is it really regional and local? Is that kind of
yeah. Well, thanks, Kevin. I mean, I was trying to cater my comments to where I think this rulemaking is going, but really we do ours at the regional level and work very closely with the locals. At our last Climate Smart update, we did we incorporated Climate Smart into our RTP, our regional transportation process, in which all of our local partners did the modeling, draft modeling, saw the results, and then did it again with us. So we were able to look at what was performing well and not performing well for climate for them, for example. So depending if you have a regional table that you can do that with closely with your local partners or not, just depends. But I encourage you to do that at that scale.
All right, thank you.
Great, thank you. And we're sharing the poll results now. So it seems like people are split between thinking we're on the DLCD is on the right track or need more information. And one person thought wrong track. So feel free to raise your hand and tell us why. That would be helpful. Let's go to Noel.
Hi, I actually was the wrong track. Maybe one guy, I guess I just wanted, with reporting, the city of Portland's doing a good job showing us right now with like housing, how you'll just get jurisdictions not reporting when the news is bad. And that reality, I think at the state level, you guys can play a really key role in some of these things by not just asking for reporting, but having like a carrot and a stick, where it's like, if you don't report and if you don't report accurate information, then this happens. Because without that, you will literally just get zero, or like you'll get made up numbers. And so I just really caution there. When Nick Fish approved inclusionary housing, he was like super explicit on the dais saying, you have to report on how this is going. Planning Bureau did a good report. Tyler Bump wrote really well for 2 periods. They then transferred it to Housing Bureau, and Housing Bureau stopped reporting because it's an answer that you don't want. That's just one example of the concerns that I think the state could get ahead of if we're really going to be able to achieve the goals we want. Thank you.
Thanks, Noel. Let's go to Kari and then Mary Kyle.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. I mostly just wanted to second what Noel was just saying. I think that local monitoring is really, really important, but that there needs to be some sort of state level accountability, that the grading or the assessment should not be done by the same locals that are putting that information forward. And I think that I guess I just didn't hear this come through in the comments. So maybe it was in there, but it did not seem to rise to the top. And I think it's really important to, again, make sure that there's consequences. If they're not making satisfactory progress, there needs to be some sort of, maybe consequences is a harsh word, but some sort of, something that does bring folks to the right place where they can start to make progress, or that there is an incentive that they will make progress, whether that's the receiving of funding or the withholding of funding or something along those lines. I would like to see that there.
Thank you. And Mary Kyle.
Thank you. And I need more information, but for this reason, I agree with everything the speakers before me said. And I think you have a long list of good things to track and report on and monitor, and you're hearing others. But I feel like at least I can only go so far in this conversation until we have the actual regional scenario plan measures established. And I think we have those from the STS. For example, 30% of all new development goes in mixed use walkable areas. You have the walkable areas defined. 40% or whatever it is, something in that neighborhood of mode shift is to non-auto modes. But once those are defined, then I think it's easier to take this conversation to the next step of which out of all these things we could report on and monitor are useful to tell us how we're doing on that thing and how that thing is getting us to meeting our greenhouse gas VMT reduction overall goals. And I do think like local is really important and regional, but some of these data points might not be trackable at certain levels like that. But in any event, until we have that, and one MPO may say they're going to invest more of their money and planning and efforts into bicycling connectivity, and another might be more on transit, and another on walking, and that is all the local actions that are going to be different, totally, and it should be. But until we have those scenario plan regional targets really set, whatever we're calling these performance measures at the scenario plan regional level, which I think we have from the STS, but I really would like to be explicit about that. It's hard to be able to winnow from these very long lists of very good things to track, but maybe that's a lot of work to track all of that.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Kyle. And maybe that's a great segue, Kevin. Any kind of next steps on this you want to provide before we move on?
I think this is great. And I think, I hear clearly on the need for accountability. And, as I think about how this is going to roll out, I think there is a need for a feedback loop for us to know how is progress being made. And if those metrics are not real, this is not a worthwhile effort. So absolutely. And Mary Kyle, to your point, yeah, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. We're talking about measures and stuff, but also the regional scenario planning needs to sort of work through that as well. Yes, we do have identified targets we just heard about from the STS. We know what those are. Ultimately, that is where we're working towards. The question is kind of how do the regions work together to get us there collectively? So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And so next, I think we'll move into our next big topic for the day, which is review of Division 44 and kind of proposed amendments to those rules. And here we're going to have DLCD staff kind of walk through the proposed rules. And we'll stop for kind of questions and comments along the way, but there's a lot to get through. So there may be times where we kind of just have to move on so that we can get through everything. And this might be sort of like the lightning round of high level comments. And then we'll ask for your more detailed thoughts through written comments and the survey after today's meeting. So we'll have about an hour for this topic, and we'll try to get through everything. So I'll hand it over to Cody and Matt to kick us off.
Hello. I think I will be providing some broad overview here, and then Cody Meyer will take it over at that point, and we'll walk through some of the specifics on the current draft here. So I want to start a little bit with some broad frame to understand where we are in this. Early on, we brought you a rulemaking charge that came from the Land Conservation Development Commission, and it had two parts in it. And it's a little tricky to figure out and keep track of what those two parts are, and we've heard from that. So I wanted to just emphasize a little bit. The part that we're working on right now is this regional scenario planning. It's the part where cities and counties work together in a region. Some of the other rules that we'll be looking at later in the summer would apply more individually, where each city and county would have that rule applying to them. But today we're talking about the rules where they work together on a regional plan. And the rules we're looking at here under the regional scenario plan, it's focused on those regional targets and the regional projections and putting all that information in, running the computer model so that you say, with all of these policies, where is it that we think our pollution will be in the future, and have we hit the target to reduce it enough? So that is a big process. It's a multi-step, it's a multi-year process. Some of the other rules that we'll be talking about again later this summer, maybe things that take effect more quickly, where there isn't a large planning process. You just kind of like, here's a new rule, you're using it. And those other things we'll talk about this summer are focusing on things that reduce the pollution. I mean, everything we're talking about here is that, and increasing the equity, but are not necessarily tied to the big plan and the projections and that modeling. And another important part about the rules that we're talking about today in this Division 44 area is the schedule and the way it sets it up. Because it is works by region, we'll set it up that Eugene and Springfield will have a schedule with dates. Salem, Kaiser will have their dates written right into the rule. And then for other metropolitan areas, the dates are not in the rule, but the rule sets up this process to allow the Land Conservation Development Commission, our friends LCDC, to initiate that process over time. We didn't put them all in the rule, but created a process for that. So this is the meeting where we're trying to look at this part of it. And then at the next meetings, when we come back in July, we'll be switching over and looking at those other elements of the rulemaking that don't fit into here. The draft you're looking at today is pretty similar to the draft that we had in January at our previous meeting. Of course, we've continued to update it and refine it since then. And there are two additional rules added to the end that we just didn't have ready in January, so we can spend some time looking at those too. Both, that draft and this draft, as I said, they're fairly similar. They include new rules that would be completely new, and they include amendments to existing rules. We're mostly going to be focusing on those new rules today because that's where the policy changes are. And just a note, as far as looking at the document here, when it's an entirely new rule, we didn't go through and underline that whole rule to show that everything on there is new text. We just simply put a note, those little gray boxes off to the side that say this is a new rule. And most of the new rules we're going to focus in on start out at number 100. We just kind of organize it that way to help think about that group of rules starting at rule 100. There are existing rules in here too, and for those, we're not going to talk about them as much today. A lot of them have to do with the Portland metropolitan area that has already gone through the regional scenario planning process, which is not to say that things are done. Certainly there's a lot of work implementing going on in the Portland metropolitan area, but we're not looking at those rules as much right now, not focusing. And for those rules where there is an existing rule that's being changed, you will see the underline and strike through to show the changes. And our goal for today is to make sure that everybody understands these rules, especially the broad sense of what the rule does and how it's structured. So I would encourage people, ask clarifying questions as we're going through this. As Cody's pulling up each section, if there's something in that section that doesn't quite make sense, ask right then while we're there before we move on. And we are going to collect any feedback today. If you have suggestions or if you've noticed things, we certainly are willing to collect that if you're ready today, but understanding that probably a lot of that will come through the detailed comments in writing after the meeting. And we've already received some of those before the meeting, in fact. So thanks to Emma, who identified a couple of cross-references. As you're working on rules, you're trying to point to different pieces, and sometimes they get misaligned as we're going through the process. So that kind of is very helpful when we get people to point out those for us. Thank you. So with that, I think we are ready to start working through the rules. And Cody, I'm going to start with 15.
Okay, great. And so if you're following along at home, this is page 22 of the 71-page rack packet. And we're just going to go through that as our guiding document here. So 15, we did add a couple, the equitable outcomes are new and community-based conversations. And I'll just note that there is one kind of discrepancy here, is that our review with the Department of Justice, though we like to speak of priority populations, there was some concern that that could be legally ambiguous as to what a priority is. And so they recommended that we stay, as far as the legal writing is, calling that out as historically marginalized communities. So that's why you'll see that a little bit written differently than the way we're kind of talking in the RAC and the other documents. Okay, so Matt, Rule 15, the compliance schedule.
So this, I think of as being really the heart of it, the roadmap. This is what sets out that there is an obligation to do all the things, and then the rest of the rules throughout this division really describe what those things are. So this is if you want to get an overview of it, you'll notice that there are, it is a little tricky there. There's these long lists of which sections apply. So that can be a little tricky, but again, most of the stuff that we're talking about today starts at that 100, and that's the new rules that would be applying everywhere, not just in the Portland metropolitan area, whereas within the Portland metropolitan area has those rules like 30 through 60. And so then where it sets it out about what it is that you have to do. Well, it's a work program. There you'll see the capital A, and then actually prepare the land use transportation plan, and then adopt the local amendments that will implement that plan. So again, that's the outline, the broad picture of what it is that the cities and counties will be required to do when their turn comes up in this schedule that we have here.
And just to be clear, this is a section here written specifically for the cities and counties in Central Lane, and below Salem Kaiser is called out separately. So I think I would add a little color here, is that Central Lane did a scenario plan in 2015, and that was not adopted. And so what this subsection B here is asking them is to use that work that was done in 2015 and bring that, as you see here, it was required by legislation, and to bring that in for adoption, but they would need to add some updates. And there is some, thank you, Emma, for pointing out our cross references were a little wrong here. We're asking that they bring that up to the current standards of this rule draft of identifying 30% of their housing in mixed use areas, and then to add a implementation chapter essentially with the performance measures. So how will this plan be implemented by the cities and counties, since we're not using a regional government structure here? Okay, so let's skip down to section 3. And so this is for the—
I do see a hand up. Mary Kyle, did you have a question on what we just went over, or what Cody just went over?
Yes, I do. Sorry. I realize we can put comments in after this, and I don't necessarily need a response, but in both little a sub B and C, there are deadlines, but then it's or other date in the adopted work program, which is more open-ended than I am comfortable with. So just mentioning that. That is, yeah. I understand there might be an extension possibility, but that's just too open-ended.
Okay, and so that was intended to give some flexibility based on procurement deadlines and when they had an idea of what work they needed to do, and that would go through the commission as well. So there would be
I understand this happens all the time, but I haven't seen an other date without like you get a 6-month extension.
Okay, I'm just kind of narrating for everyone else here, is that that is a good catch. We did put that in there to allow for some flexibility, but there would be a process for comments before that was approved.
And because you skipped over other pages, I'm just going to say, I also would like to see the word aspirational deleted wherever it is. Land use plans are always aspirational. I think it's very problematic to include that in this. So I'll include that in my written comments.
Thanks, Mary Kyle.
So we do have 24 pages to go through here, and we want to make sure, I think we hit the high notes of them. So I'm just going to kind of prod us along. This next section, very similar, is for the cities and counties within the Salem-Kaiser MPO planning area. And so that they have a very similar structure here where they would need to bring in a work program. They would need to adopt the transportation plan, or land use transportation plan, and then make local amendments. One wrinkle differently here is that since the out year is pretty far out, we kind of wanted to put them on track with the interim monitoring and reporting with the other 5 metro areas. So we wanted to say, in the meantime, you should be submitting your gap analysis. So where are your adopted plans on these range of actions now? And that would be a key step to doing the scenario planning anyway. So it wouldn't be redundant or anything. It would actually set them up nicely for when they were going to do the work. So that's the only difference there. So Matt, did you have any other comments on that one?
No. You ready to move on to talk about 4 and 5?
Yeah.
And so this is the part where the commission, Land Conservation Development Commission, will set the schedule for other metropolitan areas at future times as we have more information is available. And as we finish up with those first 2, then start additional metropolitan areas. Anybody want to raise their hand and go first? If you want to volunteer right now, go ahead. Now, I'm not seeing anybody jumping up and down right yet, but when do we get there in a year or 2?
You're gonna have to give a longer pause than that, Matt, next time.
All right.
Okay, so Matt, number 5 here. So we have a lot of factors to consider in issuing the order for the commission.
Good clarification. Thank you, Cody. Number 4 was a voluntary that the cities and counties in a region could come together at any time and say to the commission, hey, we're ready to begin. Our schedule is best to do it right now. Number 5 is where the commission would actually instead say to the cities and counties, go, it's time, get started. Obviously, there's going to be some discussion involved in working that out, but it would be a commission decision.
Okay, I think we're going to kind of try to breeze through a lot of the line item amendments. They're light, but of course, if there's something that somebody sees that they think is very something we should pause on, but I just want to make sure that we take any questions on these sections before we skip down several pages.
Okay, yeah, so any questions on this schedule piece here? I think keep going.
Okay. Great. So we do have some strike through here and happy to take comments on that as well. And I think the biggest thing here is that we've had these targets. They've been voluntary. What we are doing now is taking a may and taking it to a shall. So these will be mandatory targets going forward and consistent with our charge from the commission. So these rules here are all existing rules for the metro area. And so we have worked with them. They are now on an implementation track. So some of this kind of was language that was kind of pre-adoption phase that we were just kind of housekeeping here. All right, so now into the Rule 100. So the work program, and this would be essentially the first step to doing scenario planning would be coming to LCDC and having a plan to make a plan. So what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? How are we going to work together? Since we don't have a regional government, we're agnostic as to how folks want to work together. If it's an IGA or an MOU, or if they want to use an MPO, any acronym they can think of. We just want to kind of see what works best for each region.
Okay, so any questions or comments on that piece? All right, I think we're just going to keep breezing through, and we'll try to leave a little bit of time at the end for kind of holistic comments as well.
Okay, so the big three items here are the scope of work, the engagement plan, the funding estimate, general, just, we want to make sure that we can help pay for the stuff. And then a schedule. Like I said earlier, it was, if they needed more time or they could do it sooner, we kind of want to get an idea of when that would be, if it's going to be different than the dates set out in section 15. So this is the substance, and this is pretty long, but it is the contents of a land use and transportation scenario for the region. So these are the kind of minimum standards for what these kind of plans should include. And so it would be at least 20 years into the future. It's going to have a list of existing projects that are in the regional plans. What are people thinking about building? Because we need to quantify how much pollution might come out of those with the land uses. We need general estimates of the additional funding required, because we know to meet our goals, we're going to need a lot more transit. We're going to need a lot more bike lanes and other things. And so the federal plans have to be constrained. They don't let you really go play with different money. But what we're doing here, the reason we had that aspirational is, you have to show what it will take to get there. And if it's more money, then that's more money. And we expect to, go start working to acquire more money to build what you need, or if it's rearranging the money you're already spending.
And I think the important thing there is that the plan needs to show that if there is a shortage of money, it's not, you don't just list out a bunch of things and say, yeah, someday, somehow we will do these. You would be specific. This much is funded, this much is a gap. And that then sets the table for a lot of important discussions on the policies of how to fill that gap.
Okay, so in the land use, this is one that did apply to the central lane, was that a minimum of 30% of households living in climate-friendly areas. And we have a placeholder here because we still haven't defined that, and that'll be under the TPR work going forward. I think we'll start that in July. And that's consistent with the statewide transportation strategy goal that we talked about earlier with Brian. We also have an assessment of housing needs by historically marginalized communities. So giving people the tools they need to kind of look at land use in a more holistic way than we have done in the past. Emma, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I have some concerns and questions regarding this land use piece in relation to other state requirements that the local jurisdictions are having to respond to, and I'll provide more comments in writing. But there's some timelines through the housing rules that have been established and the buildable lands inventory work and the economic opportunities analysis and housing capacity analysis. And I'm just wondering how all these pieces fit together, and if these rules are adopted and they're kind of in conflict with some of the other timelines, how does that all play out?
Well, I could tell you we're having a lot of discussions about a lot of the housing rulemaking and deadlines, and we're, to the extent possible, we're trying to make this, kind of seamless. And so I think that when we move forward into some of the housing work later on this summer, that'll be something that, we might have to come back and revisit this if we end up going in a different direction we need to take care of here.
I think that's going to be important with regards to the work programs and the timelines. And I hear the concerns from some RAC members about, I need to get this done quickly enough, but I also don't think that we should be asking a similar thing on two different schedules of a jurisdiction. So we're kind of jumbling all the different work plan items all on top of each other and then duplicating some work and not getting some other work that's important.
We agree.
Okay, thank you.
I would hope that from a policy perspective, there should be no conflict between this. We're trying to push in the same direction on all of those. But as far as getting the schedule worked out, that will be somewhat different in each metropolitan area because the regional planning is on a different schedule in the area. So it's hard for us to write in the rule exactly how that would come together. That's where through the work plan and explain how it works for your city and your region.
Okay, I'm going to jump back in here. Number 4, section 4 here is, a long-range regional plan is good. but we need to know what specific local development regulations would need to be amended to implement that plan. And so that will tie back into performance measures and implementation. We know that we do already have a schedule and methods for how you project the greenhouse gases to comply with the targets that are up in a previous section. That's all been done. Back in 2017, we did some work there. So we know that we really want people to be able to work on what's in their wheelhouse. And so there are state and federal policies and programs that are going to be drivers for, cleaning up the vehicle fleet. But we're primarily, these targets are looking at what do cities and counties have at their disposal in their toolkit. And so it's about, you take out the contributions of vehicles, fleets, and fuels, and then you work on, what can we do locally to reduce driving, essentially. And so down here in section 7, this is the implementation. I think I kind of call it the implementation package. So this is something that we expected Central Lane would need to add to their plan. So how are you going to implement, and how are you going to track performance? What things will show implementation to go into the monitoring and reporting? And so there is actual performance for these elements. And so these might not be greenhouse gas. They would be something like, we built this many sidewalks in these areas, or we, doubled our investment in transit as a region. And those, I think that we are open to having individual reports or a regional report. I think it makes a lot of sense to have regional reports, or at least collated into a regional report. There's another, is that in equity performance measures, we need to say, how are you implementing this preferred scenario to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but how are you also implementing the scenario to improve equitable outcomes? And so that is specifically called out as well. And so
I would note that that's a section where our terminology we have to be careful with. And I think we're practicing among the DLCD and ODOT staff to try to always use these phrases carefully. The performance measures is going to be the broad category. And then there's 3 sub-elements within there: the regional outcome measures, the local action performance measures, and then the equity performance measures. And it's possible to get those all confused because they share some of the same phrases in there, but to try to be distinct about those 3 parts of it is going to be important.
Thank you. So the measures that come in should have, how are we going to measure this? So we know going forward, when reports are submitted, that we are all in agreement as to what it means to submit a performance measure. And so we have a kind of a common yardstick that we're all using. We need to have some baseline current data for the performance measures. And then MPO areas plan on a 4 to 5 year cycle, depending on their air quality conformity status. So this is just being flexible with, whatever works well. If they want to use the MPO route, which Metro does in their regional plan for their tracking of their scenario, their climate smart communities. So this is just acknowledging that, we're okay with 4 or 5 years. We want to work with what works best for each local area. Paige, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to 3 about the land uses. Sorry, I've been kind of reading through before and after it to see if I could find what I'm trying to find, and I can't find it. So, on 110, you use words like assessment and projects that are reasonably to be funded, projects that need additional funding. And then when it gets to the land use section, it seems very binary, where it's just assessment of housing needs, but it doesn't really say what you're going to do with that, or if there's a benchmark. And same with residential densities. Or employment. You could have a single family 0-0 throughout your entire plan, and it doesn't really, is that all you have to do? Or your employment density could be really low as well. It just seems like that's missing the heart of what we have been talking about with benchmarking and trying to meet some type of qualitative or quantitative standard. Am I missing something? Because it seems just very like, just measure your densities, but it doesn't say if you're supposed to have a certain amount of certain kinds of densities.
And I think what you're seeing here is we don't want to be overly prescriptive. And so there's a base case. What's going on now on the books in all these plans? Where are cities planning to put housing and employment in the future? And so that would be the residential employment densities that we need to say, okay, based on that, we know, and all the transportation that's happening, we know how much carbon is going to come out of that. That's not meeting the target. And so what are you going to do to change your course of action to get to the reduction targets? We thought it was really critically important to implement the SDS. We need to say, well, if we have a 30% of households in a mixed use area, that should be the goal for every metropolitan area. And so there are different ways to get there. You can get there through trying to add all new housing into a mixed use area, but with the inertia of how much housing stock is here today, you're adding a very small amount of housing over the future. And so you can do it through, if you have a downtown and you have a lot of capacity for adding new housing into a downtown, you could put more people into existing mixed use areas, or you could add commercial services to existing residential areas that are higher density and have some, transportation options available to them. And so we want to be flexible to the context locally, because if we try to do a one size fits all approach, we're probably going to get it wrong. We're talking about a lot of different size cities and a lot of different parts of the state. And so we thought of just we've heard this very clear through a lot of the outreach leading up to this rulemaking, was cities and counties felt like they wanted to have overall framework of climate reduction target, like mixed use housing target, and how do we do that is going to be different. And so I think that we're just trying to be flexible to different approaches here and allow for creativity to happen.
Yeah, I 100% agree. But I guess the context I'm reading is that is this the baseline measurement section where you simply measure where your plans will go if left untouched, not amended? And if that's the case, then it makes sense. But then D doesn't make sense to be put in that list because it's actually setting a benchmark.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if that is the case, it seems like you need another section where it ties to regional benchmarking for being able to improve your land uses to meet your STS goals. Because you've put 3 meetings worth of information into 3 A through E, and that to me seems very, very summarized and needs more breadth.
Okay.
I think the key part in reading 3 is to read it with section 5 that says overall it's got to meet that reduction target. So the assessments of needs and the residential densities and the employment densities have to be such that when run through the computer model, it says you will meet the target. And that's what really puts the criteria on those.
Right. If what's happening today in plans is going to meet the target, which I can tell you from working on several of these, they don't usually, then you don't need to make any changes. You're already doing all the great work that gets you to the climate reduction goals. But I think that in 3, you have a threshold to clear. And, Matt said number 5, and then we need to have an idea if you're doing a different land use pattern than what's currently adopted, it needs to have B and C. You need to know where and how much are we going to change these 2 densities.
Yeah, thanks, Cody, Matt, Paige. So I think the comment's been made, so appreciate that. And just in the interest of time, maybe try to get through the rest of this. Noel, I see your hand up as well.
I was just going to actually reinforce what Paige was mentioning there, just from on the ground, guys. I can't tell you how frequently when a project is in front of a local reviewing agency, if the purpose isn't really explicitly right there, they will construe it to however it's most convenient to the politics or to that individual engineer's preferences. So this discussion that you guys just had over the last 10 minutes shows that it's not sufficient when implemented on a project by project basis. I can't tell you how important it is to just hit the individual gatekeeper reviewing person over the head with like, here is the purpose, and otherwise you won't get it, because other forces trump in the implementing moment. So I think Paige was making a phenomenal point.
Great. Thank you both. So in the sake of time, I think I'm going to move on here, and we have section 120. And so this is just some criteria for how LCDC or the commission would review a land use transportation scenario plan. And some of this is, it's really wonky. So essentially,
well, it's a procedural rule. This is the rule that talks about the process rather than what's the outcome or the content.
Okay, so I would say that in brief, this would go to our director. The director would review it and get staff feedback. We would assume that like staff is working very closely, LCD or DLCD staff is working very closely with the local jurisdiction. So when things come up prior to these things, that we're not just getting hit with this cold. We've, been on the meetings and talking with them. So there's no surprises here. But if there's anything missing or there's something that's not correct, the director can inform the cities and counties, can we please get this rectified? So they can supply, I think I'll do the bouncing ball for everyone here, the additional information within 30 days of the notification. And then if the director or the department doesn't send a notice that there's anything that needs to be fixed within 30 days, then the submittal should be complete. And so after that 30 days of getting it complete, the scenario plan, the regional scenario plan would be posted on the department's website, and we'd give notice, and that would give basically opportunity for people to give feedback on that. And so is there objections? Is what's wrong with it? And we have to review the submittal for compliance with the rules that we have in this division if adopted. And then if the director doesn't issue an order approving the submittal, we have 60 days there. So I'm kind of skipping down here, and I apologize. I'm kind of trying to breeze through this because we got some other stuff as well to hit. And so we have a procedure for anyone to file an objection or to appeal the director's approval. And then we have, some dates upon which to do that. And then we have a procedure for the commission to hold a public hearing to go through this plan. So Matt, you want to add some?
So the one thing I'd note there is not a step where the director can reject a plan and send it back. If there's a disagreement between the local governments who've submitted it and the DLCD, that's where it goes to the commission. The Land Conservation Development Commission, they are the policymaking body. They're the ones who get to hear it. But of course, if everybody's in agreement, if it all looks good, there's no objections, then we don't need to take it to a hearing. That's what we're really trying to set up here. So a lot of plans hopefully would never go to a hearing. They're good, solid plans, and they're recognized as such, and they move straight into implementation. But if there is a dispute, we have a process to bring it to a hearing before the commission if need be.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, so any questions, comments on the commission review piece? All right, let's keep going.
Okay, so this rule here prescribes how cities and counties individual it would adopt the amendments to implement the plan. Since it's a regional plan outside of Portland area, we don't have a regional governance structure. And so really, these requirements are going to be that cities and counties are going to amend comprehensive plans, land use regulations, transportation system plans to be consistent with this regional transportation and land use scenario. So it's not good enough to just identify a plan to get somewhere. It's that you have to then start making the changes to get there. So does anyone want to talk about that? I think in the sake of time, we might want to kind of skip past some of this if someone has any questions.
Yeah, I don't see any hands up. So please don't be shy about bringing your hands up whenever you see anything you want to talk about. Yeah, just keep going.
Okay, so Rule 140, we have reporting and corrective actions. And so this is building on a lot of the great feedback that we've heard from the RAC, and that we need progress reports from the cities and counties. And so we're going to have a reporting period that was delivered with the plan contents. Remember, it said every 4 to 5 years, they would say, here's the schedule that we're going to show our reports to you. And here are the performance measures that we're going to include in those reports. And so this is really the ongoing phase of a scenario plan. Portland Metro has done this, and they've shown great work up there. We don't do a scenario plan every 4 years. This is something that's like long range. We say, here's how we're going to get there. And then we start implementation of that, and monitoring and reporting allows for course correction. So you go back and look and evaluate, where are we making progress? We can keep doing those things. What's hindering our progress, we can go back and work on those areas. And so this is the data from the performance measures that were submitted with the plan. And we also felt like there was maybe
if I could jump right there for just a second, this is where, again, why I mentioned before, it's really important to remember that when we say performance measures, there were 3 pieces of that are all pulled into that definition. So even though it's not repeated in this rule, when we say performance measures, it means the regional outcome performance measures, the local action performance measures, and the equity performance measures. All 3 of those are caught up in that definition there.
Thank you. And so one thing we heard from the RAC feedback was that maybe just some qualitative narrative would be helpful in that as well, as just showing data, what's going on, what happened, is there something that is going well? We just kind of wanted to have a little bit more opportunity to open that up a little bit. Section 4 gives a similar process for reviewing the plan. The director can find that the report is okay, or the director can find that there's some corrective actions to take, or that if the corrective actions that were identified by the city or county are inadequate, the director can can refer that to the commission to have a public hearing on that. And so again, I think that the thought process was here that we're hoping everything's going great. Staff and director can work together and approve these. Of course, we're always, taking public comment, and, people call us up and I don't like something, can you look into that? And so we do have a process for having a public hearing on those reports as well. Okay, so we have an enforcement section here, and we had a little bit of discussion there. We did want to flag just straight off is that some of this is under review, and I think that there's going to be enforcement for this entire rulemaking. It's not just for this, and so these will be slowly being pieced together over the course of the rulemaking. So it's really, we're going to have to come back and address what we kind of figure out with the rest of this rulemaking back into this section as well. But there is a compliance hearing at the request of the director. If something was inadequate, we can refer that to the commission. So the commission would hold a public hearing, and they would give notice to people to come and testify in favor or against whatever was being appealed to the commission. And so the one here is that a city's got to meet all the requirements of this division in order to expand a UGB or an urban growth boundary. And this is referencing a different rule book here that refers to the urban growth boundary expansions. And so really the intent here is to kind of align our practices as the city, county, state into achieving greenhouse gas reduction goals and improving equitable outcomes. So Emma, I see Aaron.
Yeah, I have a question / concern, kind of similar to my earlier comment about different things being in conflict. So with subsection 6 here, with the UGB expansion piece, my understanding is that there are state rules already requiring local jurisdictions to inventory our housing needs. And then sometimes one of the requirements is that we need to amend our UGB to meet the housing need work. And so I think that's under ORS 197-296. And I'm just wondering, how does that tie into this? And then also, is this really intended to be a blanket, all UGB? Because there are different reasons why a jurisdiction might expand a UGB, such as being able to treat wastewater management or include parkland and public open space, which might actually be able to contribute to some of the outcomes that we've identified as where we're wanting to head with this process. Other like school facilities, there's a number of different things that might be prohibited from happening with this section 6 as currently written, if I'm interpreting it correctly.
So I will say that to meet the requirements of this division mean that you need to identify a plan and adopt a plan and report on performance. It doesn't mean that the market is providing the housing that is in your plan. We realize that there's institutional influence and that the market does what the market does and all the people in the cities and counties do what they want to do. But what we're really trying to do is get the plans of the cities and counties going in the right direction with the right magnitudes that we're going to need. And so that is what is in there. I can't really speak to the individual requirements of the urban growth boundaries. That's outside of my wheelhouse. So I can pitch that over to Matt, or maybe we can come back with something there.
Yeah,
I just think there might be some unintended consequences with this one and some of the adoption processes. So in Springfield's situation, I believe our housing and employment UGB expansion process started back in 2008. It didn't actually get fully acknowledged until 2019. So it's just trying to figure out, like, how does this work? Are we going to be held to things that are just not at all feasible? And that's a problem.
Well, so two thoughts I would share in this. Well, three. First, thank you. It's something to look into. I hadn't thought about some of those special UGB expansions if it was just truly for a sewer plant, how that might fit in. Second is, I would say, current law already says that in order to do a UGB expansion, you have to be in compliance with everything. I mean, UGB is a time at which everything comes into there. So I'm not sure that this is actually adding a lot. And I guess the third point is, I don't expect Springfield will be out of compliance. I mean, unless you're like ignoring deadlines and refusing to adopt plans, I certainly wouldn't expect Springfield to be out of compliance with this division. So I certainly hope that this division will never prevent you from doing a UGB, because I'm hopeful that you'll always be in compliance with the division.
Okay.
I mean, I will say, pardon me for interrupting, this is Kirsten. If Emma's reading it that way, that she's not the only reader that's going to read it that way and have some concerns. So I think we just need to acknowledge that all local governments that are subject to complying with, 20-year supplies of housing and employment would have the same question, and whether or not we kind of explain it elsewhere or here. You won't be the only reader that would, that it would have questions about that, Emma. Thank you.
And I'll just, I've added that you saw we have a lot of procedural rules above that would come into play before we got down to this point. I would think that, staff has had a lot of interactions, has been on the work groups, and, obviously the director and the commission hearings. So there's a lot between today and getting to this. So we hope that we don't have to use that, but we also want to respect that, we have to, comply with a lot of requirements of the rest of the DLC rulebook.
Yeah, and I think that, we hope we don't have to get there, but if there is a situation where a jurisdiction is in non-compliance for multiple different things, how do we choose how to resolve that conflict? Because we're going to be wrong in any way if there's two state requirements that are saying, do this thing.
Okay, well, thanks for bringing that up. That's a good point. Okay, so we can move on so we can have a little bit more conversation here. Rules 200 and 210 are the interim requirements. So in the compliance schedules we looked at, have Portland Metro already done, they're doing their plan. And we have Eugene, Springfield, and Salem Kaiser identified to do the scenario planning in the near term. And so for everybody else, this would be Corvallis, Albany, Grants Pass, Rogue Valley, and Bend. It's 5. They would do what's interim reporting requirements. So this is a gap analysis that says, let's measure the things that come out of your plans, where your plan's heading. And we know that the statewide transportation strategy, as we talked about earlier, has trajectories of where the state thought that people needed or regions needed to be at in combination with a lot of other actions to meet the greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so this is strict. There's no running of the model. This is saying, where is the gap? Is the gap between reaching those STS goals in the bike ped stuff? Is it in transit? Is it in housing, mixed use development? So it really just kind of gives a report card and an idea for where the work really needs to be done. If things are looking great in the bike ped in Bend, that's great, we keep doing that. But there's a huge deficit in transit. And so that should be a focus area. And these will really help set up those local performance measures we'll be talking about in the performance measures work group, those local action-based measures. This would give basically a really good guidepost for how high do those actions need to go to get to these goals? How do we link local actions with these regional kind of outcomes-based measures? And so we've put in here, basically, if you're not in the approved work program, which means if you're anyone outside of Salem Kaiser, Central Lane, or Metro, then you would have these requirements. And so the director would find that the city and county is like, let me see, let me go back here. It's a lot to read through.
It might actually be easier to go read 210 first. Yeah. It says what's in the report before we worry about how we process it.
Thank you.
This one was kind of we got them flip-flopped here.
Okay, so in the report, thank you, Matt. We've got another schedule here. So again, we expect these to be at the regional scale. And so what works best for each region might be 4 years, it might be 5 years. We want to see a planning horizon of at least 20 years out into the future. So that would match the transportation plans and most of the land use plans. Again, we want to see an understanding of where the current land use plans are for projecting residential densities and employment densities. That help us with the gap analysis for that mixed use goal. A lot of this stuff is just going to come straight from the federal regional transportation plan. These happen every 4 or 5 years. So this is not asking for a lot of work. This is asking for data that's already there to be provided to the department. The real add here is this information that comes from the STS, or the Statewide Transportation Strategy. And so we've kind of kicked this around a lot, and we want to make sure that when we go into implementation, that we don't paint ourselves into a corner by being too prescriptive. So we just called out the categories of these strategies. So they're the compact mixed use development, EV charging availability, urban design to support multimodal walking and biking essentially, or scootering, transportation demand management programs, also called TO programs. So that could be something like, it could be the money that the regions are spending on there, it could be the amount of staff, so the amount of transit service expected, and then the parking costs and management, road growth and management, and then the alternative or renewable fuels for transit and commercial fleets. And that Typically, we don't look at fuels, but there are some things that are happening locally that can go above and beyond what might be happening in the state. So one example is in Southern Oregon, they have a renewable natural gas program for their bus fleet. And so that's something that goes kind of above and beyond what the state might be providing or the federal government. So I've got a lot of hands here.
Yeah, and Cody, did you have more to say on the 0-200? So we can just finish up on that.
You know, I mean, that's just kind of procedural stuff. So unless folks want to go into that, I think I could just read it, but I think you could read it as well. I'll just leave it up.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good. And so let's go through some of the hands. And Kirsten, do you have something to add before we
I'll be bringing a contribution from a RAC member who wasn't able to present today. So if you don't mind going to the other RAC members first, thank you.
Okay, perfect. And as hands get up, I also wanted to say that one of the RAC members wanted to know how long they can have to provide written comments on this. So maybe if DLCD can speak to that in a moment. And just for balance of speaking time, let's see, Caitlin and then Jana.
Sure. So if I'm understanding it correctly, jurisdictions outside of Salem and Lane County areas, they start interim reporting requirements, but there's nothing in here that's requiring them to actually update. There's no like prescribed dates for when they need to implement local code amendments. Is that correct? That's going to be either voluntary or decided at a later date by the commission.
That is something we will be working on in the second half of this rulemaking. So right now we're just setting the stage for that. And so this is just a screen, you know, where are actions needed and by about how much. So I would think of it that way. It's not that we're just, you know, going to take a pass here. It's that we're going to be talking about that in the Division 12, 7, and 8 coming up.
Okay. Yeah, my concern was just that it wouldn't be reflecting the urgency of the issue if we're kind of leaving the code amendment updates out for 5-10 years from now.
Right.
But as far as the scenario planning, they would not be doing the regional scenario planning, so they wouldn't have that to drive their amendments for several years, probably.
Yeah, that's my concern. If they're not doing the scenario planning for several years and then the code updates, and then we're not really seeing development corralled in the direction we're seeing until the code amendments are updated, then that's not in line with the urgency of the issue. So I'll just like to stress that that's important.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. And Jana?
Thank you, Cody. Can you move the page up when you were talking about?
Down here?
Yes.
Okay.
The alternative and renewable fuels for transit and commercial fleets. I listened to what you said and I'm still confused about what kind of data you were looking for there and what your plans are. So much of what you're talking about is kind of aimed from the transportation sector at passenger vehicles. And so I wasn't sure where we were going here.
Yeah, I do apologize. This is a lot of ground to cover. What this is looking at is giving cities, counties, employers credit for good work on if you say, hey, it's a small delivery company has a fleet of 50 vehicles and we're doing renewable energy. That's something that we can look at in our greenhouse gas targets. We have always said the state and the federal government set policy on fuels, on vehicle fleets, you know, miles per gallon and stuff like that. So all our targets are set for above and beyond. So things that the cities have in their toolkit, right? They don't set federal CAFE standards for fuel economy. But we did see that there is a lot of work going on with recapturing natural gas from a landfill or wastewater treatment facilities to power bus fleets or garbage trucks down in Southern Oregon. And so the idea here is to kind of allow for credit for that kind of stuff. So if a city, county, or someone is doing some commercial vehicle fleet, you know, that is allowed, even though everything we're doing falls within household travel. We've kind of had a little bit of a loophole where we said, yeah, if you're doing stuff there that goes above and beyond, then that's great. And we want to encourage that kind of work.
Maybe we describe this as extra credit. It's not something that would be required for cities and counties to do, but if a city or county said, hey, we are taking this action, we want to get credit for it, they can.
Yeah, I think at some point in all of the planning, we need to recognize that that commercial vehicles have very different kind of demand management, and companies that have trucks that go out and come back at night can have a lot more alternative options than over the road commercial transportation, which is what it's taken to bring you your food and medicines and the rest of that. So I just was kind of curious as to how you were ascribing this extra credit. So, okay, well, I'm still a little vague, but I won't take any more time. So thank you.
But you feel free to follow up if you want to talk about it a little bit more.
All right, Cody, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jana. So Kirsten and then Mary Kyle. And then I think we'll try to wrap up and take a quick break before our next topic.
Yep, I'll go just really quick. This is from Michael Spurlick, who wasn't able to be here today, and staff has a copy of his comments, and we'll include them with our after meeting summary too, so everyone can see it. But here he was looking for, reporting to include issues connected to accessible construction, reduction in disparities for priority populations, and also what measures are being advanced towards Vision Zero. So a more comprehensive list that staff can take under advisement. There's no need to respond today, but I just wanted to make sure Michael was represented today, if not hadn't been already. Thanks.
Appreciate that. Thank you. And Mary Kyle.
Thank you. On the interim report contents, again, I think as somebody mentioned, it's hopefully we'll come back and look at these again when we're done, because all of it's sort of substance free. It's just like categories of stuff, and it's hard to go too far into detail about it. Are these the right things to measure or not, without that, what exactly are the goals we're trying to hit in a region or at the local level? But that having been said, a few comments on what is here. And I'm in 210. Sub 3 talks about simply residential densities and employment densities. It's the location of those densities that matters, not the overall densities. And that we really have to emphasize that again and again, I think. And in sub 4, a lot of those A through H are devoted to managing the auto one way or another. And I think we don't have enough emphasis on walking, biking, transit readiness, or transit where feasible. And there's something about urban design supporting multimodal walkability. That's fine. What does that mean? I don't see anything here about sidewalk and pedestrian connectivity, getting us where we need to go, et cetera. And I'll just emphasize again that regardless of the fuel of a car, it's a car. And there's a lot of impervious surface that gets devoted to cars, regardless of their fuel. And impervious surfaces contribute to climate change adversely. They're heat islands. They divide communities. Big surface parking lots and parking garages don't serve communities, regardless of the fuel type that's in the car that's parked there. So we really, I think, need to shift to some of this, how we are thinking about this. It is really important to manage automobiles because they will be a part of all of our lives for as long as we're alive, I'm sure. But we are not serving all Oregonians who can't or don't drive or can't afford it. And I don't think just to meet our equity outcomes, we also really have to have more robust things to monitor and perform on that are related to things other than the car.
Okay. Thank you, Mary Kyle. And to wrap up here, Cody, any thoughts on kind of next steps or deadlines for written comments or soft deadlines?
Yeah, well, I mean, sooner would be great, so we can get an idea of what we need to look at. But we'll be back to the rack in July, so I would hope by June. That's a good time. You might need it with this many pages.
I think Kirsten's trying to.
Yeah, we don't want people to no going to sleep on this draft. You guys, this all sat through an hour of listening to this. So hit us while it's fresh. If you don't mind responding, I would say our normal is 1 week. We aren't flipping a rack packet real quick here. But let's, staff, if you don't mind looking at the calendar, Kevin and Bill, during break, and just saying if we can give folks 2 weeks, because obviously this is sort of the heart of it, and reading rule is not easy, but I would say at least 1 week. And we'll get back to you before they close the meeting. Thank you.
Put in my plug for getting in your comments as quickly as you can. Number one, you probably right now is the time you know the most about it if the longer you wait. But number two, I've really been pushing the staff to start working on the next set of rules that I think are going to be probably even bigger and even tougher. And so we really would like to be able to, I'm going to say wrap up, but I don't know if anything's ever really wrapped up until the commission tells us it's wrapped up. But I, as much as possible, want to wrap up this section so that we can focus a lot of attention on those other elements. So just consider that my plug for doing it sooner, please.
Yep. And so Kevin and Bill, why don't you let us know by the time Ingrid sends out the post-meeting summary, we'll put a clear deadline in that post-meeting survey so that everyone knows what the timeline is, but at least a week. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, thanks all. All right, with that, let's take a quick break. I know this is a short one, but I'm going to ask that you come back at 3:05 because we have another big topic to get through today before we end at 4. So quick stretch break, turn off your cameras, put yourself on mute, 3:05. See you then. Okay, welcome back, folks. Hopefully most of you are here. And thanks for your flexibility with that quick break there. We wanted to give a little more time to what we're going to do with our breakout sessions in the next section. So here we're going to get into a conversation on equity mapping, and in a second I'll turn it over to Cody to give us a little bit of an overview of what equity mapping could look like. And then we're going to do a little poll with this group and then spend some time in breakout sessions to further discuss. So Cody, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, great. And there we go. Well, welcome back. Thank you. This, I think, will be a little funner for me to talk through than 20 pages of administrative rule. So equity mapping is something that we have been thinking a lot about to start kind of implementing our equitable outcome statement. So Evan Manville had worked with the RAC, and several of you volunteered to help kind of refine that. And in that outcome statement, we identify what we call priority populations. And so we heard a lot of feedback on a lot of the surveys about people really kind of wanting to look at disaggregate demographic data, so we can start, prioritizing actions to these priority population areas. And so to do that, we need to kind of lay that out on a map. And so that's why we're just calling equity mapping, because disaggregate demographic mapping is pretty confusing. So an equity map is a tool to provide a visual representation of concentrations of priority populations. And I just kind of wanted to frame this up and say, we're going to be talking about, there's kind of like two different styles. The way I kind of understand this work is that you can do this in. And, we identified, I don't know, it's probably over 10 different demographic data points to define what a priority population is. And so disaggregate, or you can look at things individually. So you could have a series of 10 maps that show, here's 10 different ways that, these populations live in your city. Or what people do is they can index it or score it. And so those would be just adding those all together. And you say that each data layer would be a 1, and then you add them together, and you can see kind of like a composite to show where pockets of different folks are living. And so I have the next slide here is a little bit better visual aid. And so on the left, you can see this would be kind of a composite map. And so essentially you're taking these 4 different maps, and you're 1 + 1 + 1 = 4. And so the dark blue areas would be areas where there might be more pockets of BIPOC, elderly or seniors, low income, and people living with disability. And so Bill's chatting that that could also be a weighting or a cost function. And so if you wanted to say, well, we want to lead with race, and we feel like that should be something that we're taking into account, we could weight that more when we add this together. So that race layer could count for 1.5, and the other layers might count for 1. So that kind of like pulls that out a little bit more. And then on the right, you'll see an example of a disaggregate series of maps. And so we're just pulling maps for each of these demographic profiles and allowing cities to look at those individually. So we've been working a lot with some state agency partners to talk about what's going on with this. And we also have learned that there's a lot of work going on in the cities. So ODOT is doing some really great work now with an equity map to map concentrations of disadvantaged communities. And the layers that they're using from the US Census are race and ethnicity, looking at BIPOC areas, limited English proficiency, people with disability, people living with poverty, and then seniors. And the goal here is that the state has what Brian earlier referred to as the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program. And that is essentially all the transportation projects in the state that are going to get federal funding. I think it's state and federal funding. And it's sort of like a competitive program where, there's a lot of projects and not so much money. So how do you prioritize those to who gets the money? And so this is one way that they're looking at that in the next cycle. And so this would allow the state to put projects on these maps and score them for an equity score. So if clearly a large highway project might not get the same score as a bike sidewalk. So pulling apart some types of projects, but assuming good beneficial projects would get a higher score if they're occurring in one of these dark blue areas. And I'll just note that in looking into this, the federal Title VI, and this is in your packet, has been asking metropolitan areas to do this for a long time. And so there's actually quite a bit of work in the metro regions to map a very similar set of data layers here from the US Census.
Could you just mention that Title VI is from the Civil Rights Act of 1964? I guess I did just mention that, but it's like Title VI is in isolation doesn't necessarily mean a lot to a lot of people. But
thank you for the clarification. So I just wanted to kind of tee this up here, and I wanted to present a planner from the city of Bend, Allison Platt, who's with us today to share some of the work that she's been doing with the city of Bend. And so she's got a couple of slides coming up next, and take a couple minutes to share with you what she's up to.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cody. So hi, everyone. My name is Allison Platt. I'm a senior planner with the city of Bend. And the city of Bend has been thinking about how to apply equity mapping a little bit more robustly than we have been before. So Karen Swirsky, who's actually an alternate for this committee, was the project manager of our transportation system plan update that was recently adopted in September. And as part of that planning process, we followed sort of those Title VI requirements to map certain indicators within the city of Bend at the census block group level. And so you can see an example of one of those maps up on the screen of the left, which shows kind of poverty levels where there's a higher level of poverty than the MPO average. Those areas are shown in darker. And so what we kind of found through this process was that this data, the census block group data, isn't very granular, at least for the city of Bend, because we're a little bit smaller city. Our block groups are, they're fairly large in comparison to kind of helping us understand where to invest some of our transportation improvements. And so we identified the need through that project to develop a transportation equity program within the next 3 years. So actually by September 2023 is when our plan calls for us to do that by. And so we've been sort of exploring at the same time as the city's looking at kind of developing more of an equity framework, and we're about to hire, we have an application open for an equity and inclusion director. You can kind of go to the next slide. This has kind of been a larger conversation going on with our city at all angles, and we have a fairly new city council. Most of the members are new, and their equity is a key focus of theirs as they're going through their council goal setting. And so their 21 to 23 city council goals include using the use of equity mapping to help us meet some of our goals. So they've created a few goals where they want to look at equity mapping and other tools to assess gaps in equitable access to city services, as well as to inform a recently passed transportation bond, the implementation of that, and overall inform our capital project investments and maintenance activities. And so really using this with an emphasis on transportation, but looking at equity mapping as a tool to help us achieve and create some of our equity goals for the city overall. So we've been doing some research here locally, if you go to the next slide, to kind of just look at what other cities are doing. One of the tools that we found as a best practice is Tacoma's Equity Index, which looks at 20 different data points and then develops indices, as Cody was mentioning, kind of the combined scores for equity, livability, accessibility, economic opportunity, education, and race. So this is kind of one model that we're looking at, but really kind of just in the beginning stages of trying to figure out how do we do this more at a local level to help inform implementation of our council goals and some of our own policies.
Thank you, Allison. That's really helpful. So before we go to breakout, I just wanted to make one note is that we are not anticipating that we're going to build a tool in this group. We need to have enough an idea of where the advisory committee wants to go and what the possibilities are, so we can develop rule language. So we will be back to more administrative rule language and not be bringing mapping tools back to you. But we would expect that, to stand up those rules, we would have to put together some sort of a work group to make sure we're doing that in, a fair public realm.
Yeah, thank you, Cody. Appreciate that. And actually, before we get into breakouts, we wanted to do another quick poll just to gauge where this group's at. Ingrid, if you don't mind launching that. So we just want to hear from you whether you think this concept of using an equity map has merit, to inform decisions regarding transportation systems, whether that's using this tool to help prioritize investments or help explain why investments are made in certain areas. So just would appreciate you spending a few seconds here, letting us know initially, what do you think? And then we'll get into breakout rooms in just a few seconds here. Okay, and as people are finishing up their thoughts there, I'll say, so we're going to get into breakout rooms that are randomly assigned. And in those rooms, we're going to be talking a little bit more about equity mapping and whether this is a useful tool and any concerns or opportunities you see with such a tool. And also talk about just some different approaches to equity mapping and kind of layers wise. Would it make sense to have more of those separate maps like Cody described, or kind of an index or scoring approach? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the breakout rooms. So I think we've got most of the results here in this poll, so you can go ahead and share the results, Ingrid. So we've got some, mostly in the strongly agree or agree segment, and then some neutrals and some disagreements. So of course, want to hear any concerns when we get into those breakout rooms. So with that, I think let's get into breakout rooms, and then we'll come back at 3:40 and we'll do a report out. So we'll ask one RAC member to report out from each room. Hopefully someone that hasn't reported out before. We really want to make sure we're hearing from as many diverse voices as possible. So Ingrid will give us a warning when we're almost done with breakout rooms, and then we'll try to take some time to think about what are the key themes we want to report out in really 1 minute or less. We want to do this kind of quickly. We'll have the notes to capture all of the nuance of the conversation.
Sylvia, could you just give us a little overview there? So we're breaking out now, it's 3:20, and you want us back at, and I know this isn't a guide for discussion leaders, but just so everyone knows and can.
Yeah.
Help. Yep.
So breakout at 3:20, we'll come back in the room at 3:40. So we're kind of do a round robin in the breakout. Then we'll do about 10 minutes of report out. So like 1 minute per group. And then we'll end with next steps.
Okay, thanks. So just, I think if I could just amplify what you were saying about in the breakouts, if folks kind of are neutral, or particularly if you disagree or have concerns with the concept of equity mapping, that'd be the first question to touch on, since we've already polled. We probably don't have to go back and get individual responses on the merits of it, just more like what concerns folks might have, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, Ingrid, thank you. So go ahead and click the blue join button that pops up on your screen. See you all at 3:40.
Oh God. Darn.
Sorry, Alex.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I know we got cut off mid-sentence, and I'm sure many of you did too. Can you all hear me okay? I see some glitches. Yeah, okay. All right, well, thanks for spending some time in those discussion rooms. I know we had a really great conversation in our room, and I'll just go around to do the report out. So first we'll go to just the rooms in order. So room 1, which had Bianca and Kirsten leading that, and then room 2, which had Matt Kroll leading. So room 1. And just, brief highlights from your breakout rooms, kind of 1-minute overview would be great here.
Vandana, are you willing? I thought we were room.
Okay.
I thought we were room
I thought
3.
we were room
but
3.
Surprise, we're room 1.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, I will happily summarize for our group. We had a wonderful group, and generally that we all, we agreed. Everybody seemed to be in agreement that it's a good idea. But there was, I think, also agreement that any sort of data or mapping tool that's used should be also ground truthed in what's happening in community, so that it has more real-time feedback of of the realities on the ground. We also thought that there should be disaggregate data for various demographic groups, but also the categories, and that it should apply across the board in terms of that, what everybody is reporting to, or, not just that it shouldn't be specific just for one community, but that, that we can look at across the state. I hope I got that, Kristen. Do you want to jump in and add to that? I think that was less than a minute.
Anyone else? Did she do all right? Our group? Thank you, Vandana. Thanks, Bianca.
Thank you. And group 2, which was Matt Kroll's room.
Yeah, I think that was my group. So a lot of what Vandana already said, we discussed as well, the value of having this mapping tool to communities. Some cautions, though, were that some of the cities are so small that the information in the census blocks is really not that useful. So, for example, the city of Phoenix is really only 2 census blocks. And so it'd be really difficult to understand how investments might be made across those 2 census blocks and the impacts they would have. There was also some concern about the cost to build that, and then the updating, and then the staff responsibility, or if there would be at the local level, and being able to continue to update it over time. And like Vandana said, not considering this as like your golden ring, but that you still have to do some community proof testing and get out and actually speak with members of the community to make sure that you're making some good decisions. And then lastly, there was some concern about what kind of decisions would be made with this information if it was solidly funding, and how you would separate projects within your community, and whether that would be written within our rules, or if this is something the communities would have some more liberty to decide on.
Thank you, Paige. That's great. And then let's go to room 3, which was Bill Holmstrom's room, and then room 4, which was my room. And I know Caitlin's reporting out for that one.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah has agreed to be our presenter. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, I'm already unmuted. Sorry about that. I was causing feedback earlier. Yeah, I think that there was generally, and please, members of this group, listen, because I don't want to inadvertently misrepresent, generally support, I would say even strong support for equity mapping, with cautions regarding, misuse of data, and how maps can sometimes, there's just a lot of ways maps that can be used that are not helpful too. but strong support. Like it says here on the screen, important, Bend reported that it was an important tool. With respect to aggregation, there was, I think it was unanimous that the data needed to be disaggregated to be helpful to decision makers, and also important that there was some discussion of a need for communities from the ground up to be able to add to and or feel part of, be part of, not just feel, but be part of the data kind of decision-making process. Almost a comment was made about kind of citizen scientists and aligning the community participation with the community equity goals and participation and leadership that we've already identified in this rack.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And let's go to Caitlin with Kevin sharing his screen.
Yeah, so our group had some varying opinions on the overall idea of equity mapping, ranging from excitement about the opportunities that it provides, to understand the issues and explain why investments are necessary in certain areas. And there's also some concerns about mapping not showing the full picture, or not necessarily telling the whole story. So I think our general consensus was that it could be a great tool if the right questions are asked, and the information is able to be tailored to different jurisdictions' needs. There was also some concerns about privacy issues with mapping, making sure we're not putting anyone at risk by the information that we're showing through the mapping. And then in terms of approach, I think we lean towards approach one being preferable, mostly because different jurisdictions have different issues that they're facing. And so being able to disaggregate the data and look at things broken out by race or age to understand the different issues each jurisdiction's having is helpful. But approach two could be helpful as kind of a supplement, to have some kind of standardized rating of different areas to understand jurisdictions in comparison to each other. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. Great recap. And then let's go to group 5, which was Evan Manbell's group, and then group 6, Cody's group.
Okay. Hi, I'll be reporting out. So we talked about the importance of the limitations with using census data, in regards to data availability and validity, how census categories of race have changed over time. So the importance of relying on more than just census data, and like a lot of other groups were saying, leaning on community lived experience and knowledge to supplement that. And then in kind of looking at approach 1 versus approach 2, there are arguments on both sides. On the disaggregated data, there was support for that, but it would be important to get down to a more finer resolution than the census tract level. So possibly getting down to a neighborhood level if possible. And then as far as the aggregation, that the organization of the data would be important. So the way you label the layers for to promote better understanding. And then aggregating can also help communicate the intersectionality between demographic indicators, and could pull up into layers such as gentrification vulnerability, or vulnerability to other environmental hazards, like floodplain risk, or being next to toxic and polluting facilities, and how those can also inform land use decisions.
Thank you, Amy. And Cody's group, room 6.
Yeah, so I forgot to ask for volunteers, but Shane has offered to do that. So I will pull that up for him.
All right, thanks, Cody. And offered is a strong word. I apologize, my webcam is on the fritz today. But frankly, I think that all the other groups has pretty much hit on the things we talked about. Generally speaking, our group was supportive of the equity mapping tool. Definitely we didn't identify any big concerns other than the possibilities of misuse of the data. That was brought up and is a concern, just making sure that it wasn't used for people to target certain groups based on the maps. The other thing that was brought up as a little bit of a concern was the possibilities of disconnects between climate change work and equity. And if the mapping is just showing things going for just greenhouse gas reductions, is that equitable, or is that going to cause more of an issue? So I think the reality is that the tool's great. And we ultimately, I think, all kind of agreed we see values in both of the approaches. That, you know, the disaggregated data is going to give local jurisdictions and folks that are planning for certain outcomes a little more info to work with to target those approaches, but that the indexed approach would definitely be a good source of use for doing kind of the higher level for funding and work like that. But when we actually go down to implementing and engineering the solutions, I think someone in our group said the separate maps would be helpful. And I think the other thing that we brought up, which I heard another group say, is the mapping tools need to be used in conjunction with relationship building in the communities that the maps are showing us the data for. And I think other than that, I think the other things we had have already been touched on. So.
Thank you, Shane. Yeah, really helpful report outs. And we'll have all of the detailed notes to give us more of the details. But some of what I heard is that there was overall kind of support for using an equity mapping tool, but being careful not to lose all of that rich, nuanced information, and really needing to use good, reliable, and accurate data, and supplementing that with lived experience so that you're really getting an accurate picture of what's on the ground. I also heard that it's important, what is the purpose of this mapping? Shouldn't be mapping in isolation, it's what are you trying to do with it? And I also heard, you know, make sure that these maps don't replace the relationships. That's a really interesting point, I think important to consider going forward. And then in terms of the approaches of using the disaggregated or versus the kind of combined map layers, it sounds like there was a lot of interest in the disaggregated layers to allow more flexibility and give local jurisdictions and decision makers really all the information that there is available to help them in decision making, and making sure that communities are part of that decision making process. And I also heard that having kind of those combined layers is really helpful to provide some kind of standardization across maps and also tell the story of intersectionality and how those different data points combine to tell a deeper story. So really helpful. Thank you all for those great report outs. And I think maybe DLCD, any next steps on this particular topic of equity mapping before we kind of wrap up and go into overall next steps?
Cody?
Sorry, got me munching. No, this is really fantastic information. And I think that we're going to have to kind of take this back and try to distill it. And Sylvia, I'm like in awe of like you're able to just like take that and condense it. Wow. So yeah, I think we will have some stuff to bring back to the group in July.
Thank you. Okay, well, with that, just kind of overall next steps for the group. I think, Kevin, anything else you want to add in terms of upcoming meetings, next steps?
Yeah, Bill, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the PowerPoint again, but I just want to say great meeting, folks. That was fantastic. Really a lot of good thoughts here. So just a reminder, with this meeting, we're going to be taking a little hiatus from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. We'll be coming back on July 12th and looking forward to seeing you then. We'll have a lot more to share with you. In the meantime, please sign up to attend one or many of our community conversations. You see the schedule here in front of you. And also, don't forget about, next slide, please, the Green Infrastructure webinar, which is coming up on May 6th. So hope to see you there as well. If in the interim, you have any issues or questions or whatever, feel free to reach out to DLCD staff. And I think we have arrived at the survey question. So when would we like the survey responses back? So we're going to allow for 2 weeks. So end of day Monday, April 12th would be when we would like to get those survey responses back from you. And again, that's a great place to get into great detail on the nuances of Division 44. We really look forward to getting your guidance on that stuff. That's what I can think of for now. Anything else from other staff?
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Well, with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Lilac to just end us with any closing remarks, and then we can adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, Sylvia. I agree. What a great meeting. I think this meeting really demonstrated and really demonstrates how challenging and how difficult it is to chart new territory in state law. And that's exactly what we're all doing together with so many different voices that contribute so much to this conversation. It was really, really valuable. I really appreciated the really tough questions that were asked throughout the meeting about, so what does this mean? How does that mean? How are we going to measure this? How are we going to do this at the local level? And then such a great conversation at the end. I really enjoy those the small groups where everybody can contribute and discuss, especially a great new mapping tool like equity mapping. That to me is so exciting. And it was great to see Ben's example of how does that actually happen right here. So I want to thank you all so much for coming. Really, really tremendous work. A lot is happening, as you've already heard. Please join one of the community conversations. Unlike voting, you can do it more than once. So please participate and join those. Complete the survey in the next couple of weeks. There was so much information today, and I know I'm still processing it. And I do this for a living. I think I understand it. But after I have the benefit of all of your comments, I really look forward to going back then and completing that survey. So please do that. I look forward to seeing you all in July. And as my colleague Commissioner Warren started, they were saying, how the wildfire season is upon us. And for those of you that know, and I know some of you are in Bend, we had a major wind event here yesterday. And unfortunately, we had multiple fires start here throughout our region today, and some are still burning at this moment. So our work is so important as we tackle climate change through the equity lens. And I hate to end it on that note, but that's what we're experiencing in our community now. So I wish you all the very best. Happy spring. Hope to see you at some of the community conversations, and I'll see you on July 12th. Thank you very much.
And before you all go, I think Kevin might have a quick something.
I do. Thank you very much. I had a question in the chat about the Green Infrastructure webinar. How do we get more information? We will send out an invitation to all the RAC primary and alternate members with more information as we get closer to that event. So I know the information thus far has been a little more limited. Evan, did you want to add anything more on this? Okay. All right. Anyway, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. And thanks, Commissioner, for those great closing remarks. Thank you, everyone, and see you July 12th. And of course, we'll be at community conversations before that, but as a RAC, July 12th. See you all then. Take care.
Thanks, Sylvia. Everyone.